Sam's last line didn't arrive with the typical thunder and fire, plague, or crash of cannon. It came quietly on May 31st of 1669 in the hand of a man who'd spent nearly 10 years writing down the world as he saw it. Samuel Pepys had recorded kings and wars, sickness and money, meals and women, music and fear, ambition and vanity, and all the little ordinary limitations and irritations that made a man feel real across countless centuries. Then, with his eyesight failing, he stopped. And no, your eyesight's not failing. I chose to do today with no makeup on. I'm sorry about my invisible eyebrows. This is the strange thing about history. Sometimes the great endings don't happen in battlefields or royal chambers. Sometimes they happen at a desk, like the one I'm sitting at, or when a man lays down his pen because the price of continuing has become just a little too high. Samuel Pepys was not born into greatness. He was born in London in 1663. He was the son of John Pepys, a tailor, and Margaret Pepys, his wife, the daughter of a butcher. There's no grand estate waiting for him, no title polished and ready. There was no fleet under his command. He wasn't rich. He wasn't famous. He came into the world among the working people of London, in a city where opportunity sometimes existed, but rarely came looking for a man twice. If you saw it, you had to take it. He was one of 11 children, though death took so many that he became the eldest surviving son after only a few. That fact alone tells you something about the world that he knew. Childhood wasn't exactly soft for him. It wasn't a soft country then. Families counted losses very early. A child could grow up with ambition and fear and hunger and grief all seated at the same table with you. Pepys had something that mattered, though. He had intelligence. He had discipline when he chose to use it, which is important, and that's a distinction that a lot of people don't recognize even now. He had a talent for attaching himself to useful men and making himself necessary. That's not a small gift. In a hard world, a man who can become necessary has already learned half the game. He was educated at St. Paul's School and later went to Cambridge University. As a young man, he saw one of the great shocks of English history with his own eyes. In 1649, he attended the execution of King Charles I. Imagine that for a moment. Here's a boy standing in a crowd, watching a king lose his head, and then growing into a man who would help administer the navy under the king's own son. History has a habit of circling back with muddy boots sometimes. And in 1655, when Pepys was 22 years old, he married Elizabeth de Saint-Michel. She was only 14. Of course, that hits hard on modern ears, as it should. But things were different back then. Their marriage would become one of the rawest, most brutal parts of the diary. It was full of affection and jealousy and anger and tenderness, control, betrayal, pretty much all the rough edges of two people bound together in a household where privacy was thin and tempers were not. It was passionate. And Pepys was also sick for much of his early life. He suffered from bladder stones. It's a condition that brought terrible pain. In 1658, he underwent surgery for this, in a time when surgery was less of a medical appointment than a bargain with agony, and knowing you were going to go through that agony in advance. The stone was removed, and he survived. He was pretty lucky to have survived surgery in the 1600s. He was so grateful that he marked the anniversary of that operation for years onward in his diary. He was a man who survived that kind of pain. He may walk differently through the world after this, not only from the surgery, but also because he has a new lease on life. I understand that. He may take more pleasure where he finds it. He may fear less. He may fear more. Well, I've done both, and Pepys did both. Then came 1660, and with it came his diary. On January 1st of 1660, Samuel Pepys began writing. He did not just note the large public matters of daily life around him. He wrote about everything. He wrote the weather. He wrote about his work, his wife, his servants, his meals, his clothes, his money, his jealousies, his pleasures, his guilt, his vanity, his cat, his watch, his music, his ambitions, his sins. He wrote everything. And because he wrote with such absolute startling attention, he gave later generations something really rare. Not just history is just declared by kings and officials and official pamphlets, but history as lived by a man who woke up and dressed and argued and ate and worked and lusted and prayed and complained and worked and went to bed. That's why his diary matters so much. It's not because Pepys was always noble. He definitely was not. And not because he was always right, because he definitely was not. And not because he was always honest with others. He certainly was not. His power was that he was often honest with the paper. He wasn't expecting anybody else to ever read it. He didn't think anybody else would ever care. He wrote in shorthand, which is a system used tachygraphy, and when he wanted to hide certain things even more than that. So there were codes hidden in these pages. He mixed words in from French and Spanish and Italian, and that little trick, well, that tells us plenty. He definitely wanted his privacy, and he wanted freedom. He wanted the page to be He wanted it to hold what polite society could not. Well, his secrets. But he also preserved the diary carefully. He had it bound in leather. He cataloged it in his library. He kept the shorthand guide handy. This was not a man who was just throwing scraps into a drawer. Pepys may not have expected dinner guests to ever read his private confessions, but somewhere in him, he seems to have understood that this record that he was keeping mattered or would matter to someone, and that makes him really complicated. He hid himself, and he preserved the hiding place where he hid himself. He preserved it in leather. His diary began at a dangerous turning point. It was about the time that Oliver Cromwell had died. England was uncertain, and the old order was shifting again. Pepys had once leaned toward Cromwell's side, but like many practical men, he changed course when the wind changed. He became part of the movement that brought Charles II back from exile. He was there close enough to watch the machinery of restoration turn. He sailed with Edward Montague's fleet to bring Charles home. When the monarchy returned, Pepys benefited. Montague rose. Pepys rose with him. And in July of 1660, Pepys became clerk of the Acts to the Navy Board. Now remember, he started his diary in January of 1660. So the diary talks about all of this happening one day at a time, and it follows him through this remarkable, very tumultuous journey. The title sounds dry enough to put a listener into a nap, but the position itself mattered. That clerk of the Acts to the Navy Board. The Navy was not just ships and guns. It was contracts and supplies and wages and timber and victuals and discipline and paperwork and money and corruption. And that corruption was running under the surface like dirty water. Pepys had no deep seafaring background, but he learned, he studied, he used models of ships, he took lessons in arithmetic. He made himself useful. He was ambitious, and he knew it. He counted his money. He measured his progress. He admired status, and he wanted more of it. He could be vain and hungry for praise and suspicious of rivals and highly aware of where he stood in social order. In other words, he was human enough to be uncomfortable. And then London began to test him. In 1665, 5 years after he began his diary and was continuing to write, the Great Plague struck the city with terrible force. Plague was not new to London, but this outbreak became one of the worst. The streets were emptied and the shops were shut. Houses were marked and closed up. People feared a closed door because a closed door might mean sickness was inside. And Pepys moved through that world, and he wrote it all down. He was not among the poorest or most vulnerable. At that point, he had resources. He had choices that a lot of people didn't. Even so, he saw the fear around him. He saw the disruption, and he worried about the infection, of course. He chewed tobacco because some believed that it might protect against disease. That's right, chewing tobacco. Ugh. He wondered whether wig makers might use hair taken from corpses. It's that kind of detail that makes the past suddenly kind of take up more room in your mind. That's a disturbing detail. But Pepys also admitted something that kind of jars the modern reader. During the plague year, his own fortunes improved. He worked hard. He made money. He even wrote that he'd never lived so merrily, aside from never having gained so much as during that plague time. You have to wonder if he was truly that much of an introvert. This is one of the reasons that his diary is so valuable, though. He doesn't always give us the noble version of himself. He gives us the man who could be frightened by death in the streets and pleased by the profit of it in the exact same season. History's full of people like that. We just don't always get them to admit to it. Then came the next year, 1666. In the early hours of September 2nd, Pepys was awakened by a servant who told him there was a fire. At first, he didn't think much of it, and he went back to bed. It's kind of darkly comic, is it not? One of the most famous fires in the world. Samuel Pepys decided that it could wait until morning. But it didn't wait. When he rose again and learned the scale of the destruction around him, he went to see for himself. He took a boat. He watched London burn from the river. He saw people throwing goods into boats and trying to save what they could. He saw the fear and confusion and the helpless labor of ordinary people trying to preserve a piece of their lives while the fire of London raged through the city. Pepys went to Whitehall and told King Charles II what was happening. He advised that the house be pulled down to stop the fire spread. The king accepted the idea and sent him to tell the Lord Mayor. The Lord Mayor was overwhelmed and exhausted and unable to get people to obey him. That's another part of the history that we forget. Disasters are not managed by statues. They're managed by tired and frightened people, stubborn people, confused people, men trying to make decisions while the sky is just full of smoke and everything in their world is burning down around them, sometimes quite literally. So Pepys went home. He packed his valuables, he moved his papers, he sent goods away, and he prepared for the possibility that his own home and his own office might burn. He buried his wine and his Parmesan cheese. There are many ways to really measure a man, and way too many valuable things for him to just kind of abandon and leave behind. But one of the great ways to be able to figure him out is to look at what he decides to save when London is on fire. Pepys chose official papers, money, wine, and cheese. That may be the most human emergency list in recorded history. What would you save? Pictures? Well, they didn't have those back then. They might have had paintings, but they would have been rare. Money? Sure. Official papers? Somebody's going to need them. Would you go back for your work? I don't think I would. Wine and cheese. Yeah, that's probably my ticket. Anyway, his house survived. His office survived. Even his diary survived, and that matters more than he could have ever possibly known. Through the Second Anglo-Dutch Wars, Pepys recorded the strain of the naval administration, the failures of the government, the bitter humiliation of the Dutch success. In 1667, the Dutch raid on the Medway shook England badly. They broke through the defenses and towed away the Royal Charles, one of the great ships of the English Navy. It was a national embarrassment. It was the kind that makes officials suddenly very interested in finding someone to blame. And Pepys faced the scrutiny. The Navy Board was questioned, and committees examined the failures, and the papers were demanded. Explanations had to be made. Pepys defended himself and the board with skill, as you would expect him to. He was not merely a clerk scratching in the ledgers. He could speak and argue and organize and survive politically. And that survival instinct did carry him far. Yet while Pepys recorded the public events with astonishing value, his private record carries shadows of its own. This is where the storm turns, and not in the clean way people sometimes prefer. Samuel Pepys gave the world one of the most vivid windows into Restoration London. He also wrote down behavior towards women that's disturbing and coercive, and in some cases, he was violent. His diary records affairs and harassment and exploitation and encounters and all of these things that can't be softened, honestly, for any kind of a modern audience. So I'm not even going to try. He wrote about desire as if wanting excused his taking. He recorded his own guilt, but guilt just didn't stop him from doing the things that he did. He was not a great man. But that's the shocking thing about Pepys. The same man who preserved so much truth also preserved evidence against his own character, against what a terrible human being he really was. He hid some of it in shorthand and foreign words, but he did not exactly destroy it. He just let it live there. He cataloged it in volumes. He made sure that his personal library survived, whether from pride or habit or curiosity or vanity or some sense that the record mattered beyond his own comfort. He allowed the future to find him and find who he was. And the future did. So when we read the Pepys papers, we're not reading a clean hero. We're reading a witness. There's definitely a difference. A witness can be brilliant and flawed, universal and ugly, honest on paper and dishonest in life. And Pepys forces us to sit with that discomfort. If you ever get a chance to read his papers, I would suggest going through them if you can. It's not easy, but it's definitely interesting. The man gave us plague, fire, war, politics, theater, household life, naval reform, and even personal confession in very ugly ways. He also gave us a man who could see much and still fail morally in ways that mattered in a very big way. By 1669, the diary was wearing on him, or rather, the work of keeping it was wearing on his eyes. Pepys feared that writing by poor lighting had damaged his eyesight. He worried that he might go blind. For a man whose life depended on paperwork and observation and letters and accounts and careful reading, that was nothing small. On May 31st of 1669, he made his final diary entry. He suggested he might continue by dictating to others, but that was not the same. Dictation would cost him the thing that made the diary what it was, his privacy. A man might dictate official business to a clerk. He might dictate a letter. He might dictate a report, but he couldn't dictate the raw, coded, private truth of himself without changing it. Once another person enters the room, confession puts on a coat or a mask and it starts to hide. So instead, he stopped. He didn't die then. That may be the strangest part. The diary ends that Pepys didn't. He lived for more than 30 years after that last entry. He continued in public life. He became a Secretary of the Admiralty. He served as a member of Parliament. He became president of the Royal Society. During his presidency, Isaac Newton's Principles of Mathematics was published with Pepys's authorization on the title page. The man whose private diary gives us plagues and theater and gossip and marital quarrels and political fear and lust and ambition and buried cheeses also stands at the edge of one of the greatest scientific publications in history. Pepys was not merely a diarist who wandered through important events. He belonged to the machinery of his age. But without the diary, the later Pepys feels a bit more distant. We know what he did before that, but we don't hear him in quite the same way after that. The voice that made him cross the centuries went oddly silent in 1669. He'd only had his diary for 9 years. The man remained, but the intimate witness of it all disappeared. His wife Elizabeth died later that same year, in November of 1969. It was after their return from travel in France. Pepys never remarried. He continued to build his career, his library, his reputation. He was imprisoned more than once on suspicion and later political storms, but no charges were successfully brought. Eventually, he retired from public life and died in 1703. I'd love to know more about what was going through his head when he was being imprisoned more than once. What was going on? But we'll never know because he didn't write those down. Pepys was buried with Elizabeth in St. Olave's Church in London. But the diary did not die with him. Pepys had collected books and manuscripts and prints. Manuscripts, not scraps, but sure, same thing, I guess. And prints and ballads and naval records. He collected all of these things with so much care. And at his death, his library held more than 3,000 volumes. And this is the time when paper was money. The diary was among them, bound in 6 volumes and written in shorthand. He had made arrangements for the preservation of his library, and eventually it went to the Magdalene College in Cambridge. For a long time, the diary remained unread by the public. But then in the 19th century, scholars began to decipher it. One man labored over the shorthand that he'd written for years without realizing that a key to the system sat nearby in the exact same library. This was almost too perfect. The secret to reading Pepys was sitting a few shelves away, waiting quietly while human effort did things the hard way. Such a human way to do things, though. Early published editions left parts out, especially the sexual material, considering it was really obscene, violence, that kind of stuff. People didn't want to see that back then. Later editions restored a bit more, and eventually the full and unexpurgated diary did become available, and the world could see Pepys more clearly, for better or for worse. That's the bargain his diary makes with us. It does not offer a polished monument. It offers a man. He could be brave during crisis and petty in comfort. He could serve the Navy with brilliance and enrich himself through corruption. He could love books and music and theater and science and conversation. He could also betray and extort and conceal. He could write with compassion about public suffering while remaining sharply interested in his own advantages and cause public suffering of his own. And that's why his entries matter so much. On May 31st of 1669, Samuel Pepys did not just stop writing. He closed a door on one of history's most revealing rooms. Behind that door had been almost 10 years of London life, from the return of a king to the burning of a city. The diary had caught the grand and the grubby all together. It had shown history with its boots on, its pockets full, and its conscience not always clean. After that day, the world kept moving. The ships sailed, the kings ruled. parliaments argued, London was rebuilt, and Pepys worked and aged and succeeded and feared and eventually died. But the daily diary, the witness, was gone. Maybe his eyes truly needed rest. Maybe he feared blindness more than silence. Maybe he knew that dictating would make honesty impossible. It probably would have with what he revealed. Maybe after years of writing himself down, he had reached the edge of what he was willing to preserve. Whatever the reason, that final page leaves us with a hard truth. History is never complete. Even when a man writes more than 1 million words, there's still a silence waiting at the end. So here's my question for you. If Samuel Pepys had dictated the rest of his life to a clerk, do you think we would have gained more history or lost the private honesty that made his diary so unforgettable? And have you ever heard of this man? Are you interested in reading his stories? Tell me your answer in the comments, because this is one of those rare stories where silence may have protected the truth better than the words ever could. And if you enjoy stories like this, please hit that like, share, subscribe. I know that sounds cliche, but it really does help. And follow the History Happens Facebook page for more deep dives into history's most fascinating moments. And subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Every subscriber helps. And this podcast still doesn't have any reviews. I'd love to get a review from you. Thank you for watching.